Hey, we're gonna go move into the history of space exploration. This will be probably a two-part video. We'll do half on this one and half on a different video. So just to kind of go over with you guys, back in the 60s, there was something called the space race. And this we're going to go through in this slideshow, but it was basically a race between us and the USSR, which is pretty much Russia. Soviet Union, if I should say. Probably more familiar with that word. But if you notice on this first slide here, there's going to be different series of missions. There's even, I haven't watched it yet, but I know on Disney Plus, there's even that series about the Mercury missions with the gentlemen who were on that, who were part of that program. But just to kind of go over with you, there's going to be 3 sets of missions we cover under NASA. And the first set of missions is the Mercury missions. This is how NASA began with the Mercury missions. The second set is the Gemini missions. Okay, and we'll talk about those. The third set are the Apollo missions. When we go through these, you'll need to know them in this order. So if I ever ask you what the missions are, you need to tell me Mercury, then Gemini, and then Apollo. Alrighty? This picture here is a picture of a satellite. So in the late 1950s, the Soviet Union launched the first ever satellite into space, and this was known as Sputnik 1. Kind of a funny name, but this is what it looked like. This is the first satellite that went into space. This was the start of the initial space race between USA and the Soviet Union. So yeah, if I ever ask you how did the space race begin, it was from 1957 when Sputnik 1 was launched into space. So the space race was initiated at that time because at that time it was known that if you control the skies, you will have more power. All right, you'll have more power. The president at the time was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And in 1958, he created NASA. And NASA stands for National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So basically, this administration would take steps forward to get men into space safely and then come on back. So, like I said, the first set of missions under NASA, because this program was started from the launch of Sputnik 1 into space. So I want to let you guys know that at the time, we struck back at the Soviet Union, and we went ahead and tried to launch our satellite into space. And at the time, I forget what it was called, but at the time when we launched it, it literally didn't even really took off. It was like the day of the launch and kind of like took off and then crashed back down to Earth. And it was like, they did like a pun on it in the news, and it was like Flopnik, Kaputnik, kind of a pun off Sputnik 1. And it was like kind of a bad moment because it was thought like we were never going to get to that point. So we initially then got a satellite into space, but it wasn't good enough because before you knew it, the Soviet Union got their first man into space, and that man is known as Yuri Gagarin. If I ever ask you who was the first Soviet Union astronaut into space, you would tell me Yuri Gagarin. So these Mercury missions from 1958 to 1963, these were the Mercury missions. The whole goal of these missions were to get the first man into space, all right? To get them into space and back home safely. And it was a really relatively short trip. It wasn't like to the moon or nothing like that. It was just into space and back home safely. So, again, we need to, during the Mercury missions, we actually did get a man in space. Then eventually we got them to orbit around Earth eventually. We got to learn more about the human body in space. And then we wanted to make sure that under all those guidelines, we made sure we could recover both man and the spacecraft safely, that there were no flaws, okay? So the Mercury missions, how did we even begin? How did we know it was safe? Well, you guys got to remember, nowadays we have, animal rights and PETA and whatnot that would protect animals from this, but at the time it was not a big deal. We were talking about the late 1950s, and at the time they would launch animals. Eventually they even launched chimpanzees, and there is an actual documentary on this on Disney Plus. I forget the name of it, but it's a hour and a half long or something, and you kind of see the monkeys go into space and stuff. But just to let you know, if they were able to make it back home, these little chimpanzees, then it was safe for humans. So one of which, was Sam the monkey. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of the beginning that we kind of realized, hey, we can launch a man into space. Why was this Project Mercury important? Well, NASA did learn a whole bunch from this. It learned how people could live and work in space, the beginnings of everything, how to operate a spacecraft in orbit around the Earth. And these were really small victories at the time, massive, but small victories nonetheless, because we had goals, and our goals were to eventually get to the moon, but by no means were anywhere close yet. All right. So just note that was all the Mercury missions. That Mercury astronauts, now this is really important. The Mercury astronauts were 7 astronauts that were selected in 1959, and they had to pass a series of tests. They had to be of a certain age, eyesight, physically fit, all that stuff. And these men had no fear, So Alan Shepard, he's going to be the first Mercury flight, meaning he's the first man in space and back down. It was a really fast flight, wasn't hours long or anything. It was about 15 minutes. He got into space and then came back down. Then we had Gus Grissom. He was the second astronaut in space. Then we had Scott Carpenter. He was another one that got into space, and he was the second astronaut to orbit the Earth, Scott Carpenter. If you see right here, a guy by the name of John Glenn. John Glenn became a senator eventually, but he was the first American astronaut to orbit the Earth. So remember that. The first astronaut into space is Alan Shepard. The first American into space, Alan Shepard. The first American astronaut to orbit the Earth is John Glenn. But the very first Soviet Union astronaut and the very first astronaut in general was Yuri Gagarin to get into space. All right. There's a video here, and I will upload this slideshow on the agenda if you wanted to watch it. It's an hour long or something like that, but it's a really cool documentary if you're into space and the space race or history type stuff. I am, but I'm not going to play this right now because I have other things I want to show you. So you're going to move into Project Gemini, and in this first video, we're going to cover Project Mercury and Gemini. The second video, you're going to do Project Apollo, and then we'll start some of videos to kind of show you little visual aids with everything, okay? But in Project Mercury, Project Mercury was one-manned missions, very short one-man missions. Project Gemini, which is the second program under NASA, and this program was getting more than one man into space. So it was 2-man crews into space, and to kind of progress off what the Mercury missions did. Okay. So this would kind of prep NASA for more of getting to the moon. Okay. So this is kind of prep, dress rehearsal prep type stuff. Sorry. So the goals for Project Gemini were to get 2 men into space, and where they would do longer durations, like maybe up to 2 weeks throughout the Project Gemini, to understand the spacecrafts more. And if you know anything about space, which I do, but I'm not like that familiar with the crafts and everything. However, they would kind of do different rendezvous docking stuff in orbit to prep them to get to the moon. They would learn about re-entry and landing, how to like be safe about that, what are the perfect ways to do that, perfect places to land, just to kind of learn about even more about the human body in space. Gemini crew members, you can kind of see the list here, pointing out a few of them to you. Neil Armstrong, I know you kind of recognize that name. Michael Collins is another one. Ed White is a big name. Pete Conrad. I mean, they're all listed here. But this was the Gemini mission. During the Gemini mission, a cool thing to note was Ed White. He was the first American astronaut to step outside the spacecraft and let go, setting himself in like zero gravity of space, and he did the first spacewalk. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Buzz Aldrin. He is known as having the longest world record, pretty much, of 5 hours and 30 minute spacewalk. That's crazy. But anyways, he's known as having the first selfie in space. Okay. This next video, I'm going to pause now because the next video you'll move into the last mission of NASA, and this is the Apollo missions, and this is more so moving into the JFK era of the early 1960s throughout the 1960s, pretty much. Okay, so finish up, and then we'll move into the next video on the Apollo program.